Hello friends, welcome back to Digitalk. So in the previous session, we have covered about the different kind of distributions of Kubernetes, where we have covered the managed Kubernetes and what are the benefits of managed Kubernetes, which is supported by some cloud service provider, right? And what are the downsides of managed Kubernetes? And along with that, we have talked about the different pros and cons of the Kubernetes in the on-prem or in your local data center, which is a traditional data center, or maybe when it is in cloud, right? So now in this session, I am going to cover that in bit detail. Okay, like if you are configuring the Kubernetes in any of the cloud. Okay, for example, we are going to talk about the AWS cloud, where the Kubernetes is with the name of Elastic Kubernetes Service, EKS. So what are the high level of steps that you have to follow when you are going to configure the Kubernetes cluster in AWS? Moreover, the steps would also almost same when you go for the other cloud service providers as well. The only thing is that the certain terms will be different according to the services that has been designed in that particular cloud service provider. Right, and then we will compare if we are going to set up our own local on-premise Kubernetes cluster. Then what are the high-level steps that we have to follow? Now after that we will compare the difference between both. Okay, how the why this managed cloud service is also always preferable when we go for the Kubernetes setup. Okay, so now when we talk about the configuration of Kubernetes in the AWS, okay, the first thing is that you have to set up an EC2 machine. Okay, this is one of the virtual machine that you have to create in your AWS cloud account. Okay, where you have to configure the AWS CLI and then kubectl. So AWS CLI is the command line interface which we configure to configure the different kind of a, or you can say for the management of the all the resources of the AWS cloud. Okay, so that means whatever the resources that you configure from the AWS console with the help of browser, the same all the configurations that you can do from the command line as well. And for that, you have to install the AWS CLI. Now, this AWS CLI is required to configure the kubectl, which is the client interface for the management of your Kubernetes cluster. So whenever we do the management of Kubernetes cluster, okay, for example, when we create a different resources in Kubernetes, like the deployments, and then we create a different pods, clusters, services. Okay, so all these things we create with the help of kubectl. Okay, so all these commands that we are going to run from EC2 machine, and that's the reason you have to first configure an EC2 machine with the where you have to configure the AWS CLI and then kubectl. Okay, and then you have to assign an EC2 policy, okay, to this EC2 machine. Why? Because this EC2 machine is going to contact your Kubernetes cluster, where it is going to manage your different resources with the help of kubectl, which we have installed in this particular EC2 machine. Okay, so for that you have to assign a certain kind of a roles so that your this EC2 machine can reach to your Kubernetes cluster and then can do the management of your resources. Okay, so the process is very straightforward in the AWS. There is an option to create a role in the identity and access management. Okay, and there you can create a role, and these are the 4 different policies that you can assign to your role. And then later this particular role we need to attach to the EC2 machine. So that is the first step. Second, after that we have to set up the EKS cluster. Okay, which means we are going to create the master node, which is also called the control plane. Okay, so for that again it's a very straightforward process. You can go to the AWS console and then go to the EKS option in the console, and then you can click on the add cluster, and then you can create the cluster. Okay, so once you will create the cluster, it will prompt you for some different options. Okay, and then if you do not have this some set of knowledge on the networking sites, okay, for example the VPC and then the subnets, okay, so that automatically configured for you in the AWS. Okay, it default configure with the some default of the configurations for the networking. Okay, and apart from that, you have to provide certain kind of a basic information for your cluster. Okay, so similar to the EC2 policy role that we have defined for the EC2 machine, so here you have to define a role for your EKS cluster as well, because this cluster is going to manage your worker nodes, right? So for that, you have to assign a certain kind of a policy in terms of the role. Okay, so for that, when we configure the role, for that we will get a different kind of a use cases when we are going to configure a role, and for that we have to select the EKS cluster role. Okay, as you can see in the screen. right? And then when we go for the different configurations of the cluster, as I said that if you do not have a complete clarity on the networking concepts, okay, then it will automatically create some different resources for you. For example, VPCs, subnets, and then we have some different more kind of more options are there. So that will be get configured for you automatically. Okay, so once your EKS cluster is ready, that means your master node is ready, then you have to go for the node group. So node group is nothing but it is a worker nodes. Okay, where we have a different pods and containers are running. So once your EKS cluster is ready, then you have to configure a node group. Okay, and inside the node group, we configure the different nodes. Okay, that means each node is represent a different virtual machine in the EC2 cloud. Okay, so for example, if when we configure the node group, okay, we define the different kind of a node that we need in this particular node group. For example, you need the two nodes, then you can assign the two count for that, and it will automatically configure with the two nodes. That means it will automatically create two virtual machines for you, which will act as a worker node and which you are going to control with the help of EKS cluster. Now again, just like the EC2 machine and EKS master node policy, you have to create a policy, or you can say a role for the node group as well. Okay, so just like we created the role for the EKS cluster master node, similarly we have to create the node group policies or role as well. And apart from that, you have to assign some different configurations. Okay, like when we configure the node group, and then which OS image that need to be configured. That means which OS it has to be selected for the node, then what kind of a image, what is the size of the disk, number of nodes that you want in the node group. So this kind of a configuration that you have to provide when you are going to configure the node group. Okay, so these are the different policies that you have to assign to your role that you are going to create for your node group. So there are four different set of policies. Okay, this we assign to the role which we attach to our node group. So these are the high level of the steps that you follow when we configure the EKS cluster in the AWS cloud. Let me reiterate, it's a very straightforward process. Create an EC2 machine and then configure the AWS CLI and kubectl, which is a very simple process for the installation and configuration of AWS CLI and kubectl, which we are going to cover in the future sessions. Then we have to attach a policy. Then we create a EKS cluster from the console. And for that, we create a role which we can attach to the EKS cluster. And then we have to provide certain set of inputs when we are creating the EKS cluster. Similarly, you have to create a node group, and similarly, we have to assign a role to the node group, and then we have to provide certain kind of inputs for the configuration of the node group. So this is the high level step that we follow when we go for the configuration of Kubernetes cluster. Okay, so if I talk about the rough timing that you need to for all this kind of a setup is not going to take more than 1 hour. Okay, creation of a EC2 machine and then setup of AWS CLI, kubectl and policy, it is hardly going to take 15 to 20 minutes. Next 20 to 25 minutes, it is going to take setup of the EKS cluster. And then next 20 to 25 minutes, it is going to take for setup of the node group. So hardly within a 1 hour or one to 2 hours, your setup will be ready of the Kubernetes cluster. Okay. Now the complete infrastructure along with high availability, load balancing, failure and scalability of your environment is completely going to be taken care by your cloud service provider. You don't need to worry about the complete infrastructure. Okay, all the management of your the backend infrastructure, and then the load balancing, and then failover, and then scalability of your environment. Okay, everything is going to be managed by your CSP, which is a cloud service provider. Now let us talk about the self-managed Kubernetes cluster. For example, you want your own self Kubernetes cluster where you want to set up in your own on-premise environment, right? So what are the high-level steps that you have to follow? The first thing, you have to planning for your infrastructure, provisioning of VMs, or maybe it could be a physical machines. Okay, then how many VMs you need? You need a control plane, which is a master node. You need a high availability for that as well. So that means you need a more than one node for the control plane, master node. Okay, you need the node for the worker nodes. Then you have to define the networking requirement for your machines or your virtual machines. Then plan a pod networking range for inter-pod communication. You have to make sure that the sufficient CIDR or the IP address are available for all of the machines, or you can say for all of the pods that you are going to create in your this Kubernetes worker nodes. Then you have to define the storage, how much storage is required for your machines, or you can say for a Kubernetes cluster. So these are the basic requirement of the infrastructure. There are a lot of more things that you have to take care when you are going for the infrastructure planning in the on-premise Kubernetes or the self-managed Kubernetes. Okay, if we compare it with the cloud service providers, okay, you within a couple of minutes you can configure and start up your Linux machines. And when we talk about the on-prem, you can see that you have to planning for the infrastructure, and then you have to buy your service infrastructure, and then you have to go for the provisioning of all of the machines, worker nodes, their networking, and everything you have to take care. Now, after that, you have to install certain Kubernetes dependencies. You such like kubelet and kubeadm, kubectl. These are the different utilities that you have to install and configure. Then you have to install and configure a container runtime, for example, the Docker. Then you have to set up the control plane, which is the master node, where you have to initialize the kubeadm, which configure your multiple components that we need to be in the master node. Okay, and then you have to join the worker node. So when you provision the worker nodes, okay, then you have to run the join command, okay, so that your worker nodes can join your master node. Okay, and then you take care of the network plugins. So these network plugins are allow your different pods to be communicate with each other when they are on the different nodes. That means on the different virtual machines or different physical servers. So you have to configure the network plugins. Then you have to configure the DNS and load balancing for your workloads. Then you have to enable the storage and persistent volumes for your Kubernetes cluster and worker nodes. You have to set up monitoring and logging. You have to set up the access control and security. So these are the high level steps, okay, that you have to take care when you are going for a self-managed Kubernetes cluster. And apart from that, the complete infrastructure along with high availability, load balancing, failover, everything has to be managed by you. You have to take care of your scalability as well. Okay, for example, today you have a load of 1,000 users. So tomorrow you may be expecting the load of the user could get increased from 1,000 to 1,500 or maybe 2,000. So at that moment, you have to plan for the scaling of your environment as well, right? So when you are on the cloud, is everything is taken care by the cloud service provider. But when you are going for a self-managed Kubernetes, then you can understand now how complex it is. You have to understand, you have to take care of everything from the infrastructure planning to the installation, configuration, management, and then run and maintenance of your Kubernetes environment as well. So this is the high level comparison of when you go for the managed Kubernetes cluster and when you go for the self-managed Kubernetes cluster.